The 411 Live.
Where you can learn about issues that affect us every day. State of world, 411 Live.
Real people, real talk.
Made to help people in our community in every way. For your girl, 411 Live.
Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender youth and young adults are particularly vulnerable for sex trafficking. In some studies, it says that it's even more so than their heterosexual counterparts. And we're going to be talking about that today. Hello, I'm Beverly Taylor, and this is the 411 Live. Real people, real talk. Now, our mission is to bring awareness to human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, and also the healing process that goes on from the trauma of sex trafficking. Joining me now is Sandra Zapata. She is Counseling and Advocacy Coordinator with Milwaukee LGBT Community Center. And our topic for the day is how sex trafficking affects the LGBTQ community. Welcome to you, Sandra.
Absolutely.
So when we talk about this, because we're in our second season. We have done so many topics dealing with sex trafficking,
Right.
but not specifically about this. I'm wondering, do you think that in the discussion about sex trafficking, the LGBTQ, and I'll mess that up several times throughout, so be patient with me. Do you think that community is kind of left out of the discussion?
Yes, I think we don't necessarily have that conversation often. Oftentimes, sex trafficking focuses on women or young girls, which we understand that is definitely a targeted demographic. However, we also know that especially LGBTQ youth is particularly vulnerable because they experience high levels of homelessness. They experience high levels of bullying, not just outside the home, but inside the home as well. So we know that our youth is particularly vulnerable, but we don't necessarily focus on our demographic when we are talking about sex trafficking in general.
Yeah, let's talk about this whole thing about homelessness, because that seems to be I don't know if you want to call it a symptom, but one of the reasons that they are extremely vulnerable. Because when you're homeless, you're trying to survive.
Correct.
So tell me a little bit about that dynamic.
So we know that, and there's different statistics out there, anywhere from 60 to 56% of homeless folks happen to be part of the LGBTQ community. Whether that is because their families have decided to kick them out of the house, or they have decided to leave the house because it's a toxic environment for them. LGBTQ folks are not going to choose homelessness if they have the support at home. So it largely stems from not having a supportive home environment that will leave them open to ending up either in foster care or just being homeless because they're being kicked out or because they've decided to leave home.
And when you're out on the street,
Right.
And a lot of them are young.
Right.
I mean, you have to survive. So you need a place to stay.
Right.
You need some food.
Yes.
You need clothes on your back.
Right.
So that puts you in that position, whereas, say, a trafficker,
Right.
they see you, they see your need, they see your vulnerability, and they can say, hey, I can help you.
Right. A lot of the youth that happens to end up homeless and they happen to be LGBTQ, they will be more vulnerable to traffickers because not only do they need those things for survival, but also the likelihood of these youth not having a support system to begin with is high, right? So if you've already been kicked out of home and you don't have family members to look after you or come looking for you or offer safe space, then you're going to try to find the the next thing, right? The next person that is willing to help you out, to give you a meal, to give you a place to sleep,
Yeah.
right? And sometimes that comes with a price, and that price can be sex.
Right, right. And, you know, part of sex trafficking, it's that whole deception
Right.
is part of it. Force is part of it. It's dangling that thing in front of somebody's face and saying, you know, I got you. Here's food, here's shelter. And then later on, it's, you owe me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they already don't have anyone to turn to, right? They don't have a family to go back to necessarily, or because the services are not necessarily prepared to work with LGBTQ folks, then who do they turn to, right? If in shelter, they're not going to feel safe, especially for trans individuals. Sometimes shelters are not equipped to work with trans folks, and they get misgendered, or they will be put in the wrong sleeping space, which would in turn make them more vulnerable, right? If we're trying to help people find a way out of homelessness, but we're misgendering them, or we're constantly questioning who they are versus supporting them as who they are,
Right.
then it's going to make it harder, right? I don't want to go to a place where I'm going to be questioned on who I am. Like, I've already had to do that work myself. I've had to come out. I've had to tell family and friends, and maybe that what made me end up homeless in the first place. And then the people who would be able to help fall in that same category of they don't understand me,
Right.
and they are not ready to help me because they don't know how to help me, or they're not willing to learn, which also happens.
So there's an awareness gap there.
Absolutely.
So I also read that transgender individuals
Correct.
are even more susceptible to sex trafficking. Why is that?
So there's a misunderstanding that general public has decided on, that being transgender may not necessarily be accurate, I guess. People think like, oh, you're just looking for attention, or you don't really know what that means, or it's a disorder. It really isn't. This is just the way that people feel, right? When I close my eyes and I think about who I am as a person, I can see myself in my gender. That's it. This is just who they are. And for people to question that, it just feels like you're asking someone to, or I guess you're questioning who they are as people. And it creates this rejection in society. People don't understand what transgender means. They don't know how to better work with people who are trans. They don't understand it. They don't want to necessarily learn because they want to just make it seem as like you're just looking for attention, and this is not really who you are. Even though in different communities, we know that there are more than two genders, right? And in our society, we have decided that male and female is the only genders that we quote unquote recognize. But in other cultures, in other times, we have seen people who identify with more than two genders, right? We have in communities, like in Mexico, we have in Oaxaca, the term mushe, which means, it comes from the word for woman, but it's these folks who were assigned male at birth, but they are women, right? And so you can be male, you can be female, you can be mushe, which means almost like a combination of the two, and they can present in whichever way they want, right?
Okay.
So in different cultures, we have different understandings of gender. You can have up to 5 genders or more, depending on where you live, what time in the continuum
Really?
space. Yes. So this idea of binaries and having only male and female is relatively new. I think a lot of Indigenous folks have different terms, right? We have terms like Two-Spirit for Indigenous folks, where you understand that your physical body, your spirit, can be a combination of male and female, or it can be a combination of different genders in the same person. So this very strict understanding of male and female is very exclusive to this time and place into our community.
Okay.
So it's not everywhere.
So I would suspect for transgender, the vulnerability, I could see it heightened because people don't know exactly, they're not aware.
Correct.
And may pull away.
Right.
But a trafficker is coming forward, saying, I accept you.
Right.
Gotcha.
And I think also part of it is that in our society, we have decided that people who fall in this category, who are trans, they have a very specific role, I guess, in society. So oftentimes, we don't accept trans folks in a lot of jobs. So historically, they have been turning to sex work for livelihood, right? And it's not necessarily that they are not capable, but that's kind of how society has pushed folks right to the side to make these decisions, because this is the only work they're able to find. I'm hoping that with education and conversations, we're changing that perspective, and that people understand that trans folks exist and they are not different from anybody else, right? And they can do really jobs. And I think we have this weird understanding of like, we have female jobs and we have male jobs, and we have gender things that make no sense. We have very strict rules about who gets to stay home and who gets to earn more money in a household and how you should present. And we have so many rules about how people should be or should be doing life. Right. So I think the community itself won't necessarily fall into those patterns.
Not as open.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's going to look different for a lot of folks. Just how you go about, earning a career or just doing life itself, right? Like, because I feel like we have these very specific timetables, right? Like you go to college and then you get a job and then you get married and then you have kids. Well, if you're a part of the LGBTQ community, there are no rules to follow.
Gotcha. Okay. I understand
so
what you're
it's
saying.
hard, right? Like it's hard to make up a timeline.
Okay. Now, you work with the Milwaukee LGBT Community Center.
Yes.
You have seen a lot of things.
Yes.
So we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about some of those things and resources. What's out there? Housing, things that are needed within our community.
Sure.
So we're going to take a break. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
Human trafficking is a global issue that is happening locally. This is a problem that we cannot ignore.
Being so scared on that hotel bed and wish I had my money. Going back into that feeling of, man, what am I getting myself into?
She rests her head on the prison to which she's chained.
I'm standing there and I can't move. I can't go nowhere, I'm stuck.
Drug into this spider's web, and she can't untangle herself to freedom.
Him telling me how pretty I am and what I can do to trick guys out of money and what I need to do and how much money I need to bring back, and him making me change into different lingeries to take pictures of me to put me on Craigslist. Now I'm a product to be sold.
Beneath this ground we walk is a hell of movement in a forced direction. Gridlocked, traffic lights, sex, currency, bodies, stock, fear, monopolized, auction, blocks.
Another job, he come another one, and just being sold over and over and over and over.
Minds groomed to be immune to pain.
And you used to it, and you just lay there.
Numb, desensitized, innocence, drained.
I went from that scared little girl, from in foster care, from being molested by my stepbrother, by my foster brother, to being a lonely little girl stuck in a house, so scared with my mother, to being trafficked.
Welcome back to the 411 Live. I'm Beverly Taylor. We are continuing our discussion on how sex trafficking affects the LGBTQ community. Joining me again, Sandra Zapata, and you work with, of course, the Milwaukee LGBT Community Center. How do you get your clients?
So there's different ways that we do outreach. We go to community events. We've been expanding community services, I guess, trying to make it more inclusive. Sometimes what happens in queer spaces is that they tend to be very white, and people who are in leadership tend to be white. And so sometimes within the community, we forget about those intersections of, being queer, but also being a person of color, or being, of different country, right? So immigration
right.
and those things that happen really to anyone in our community. So we've been trying to do more outreach out in the community, in communities of color. We really will go to any event that we're invited to that we can see a way of reaching different people. So we've been doing a lot of community marketplaces and just different places where other communities unite. So we're trying to expand our outreach out in the community through community partnerships. So we'll do more cultural-specific programming. So we are doing, coming up in March, creative healing series. And so we are going to do a writing workshop, and we're having someone in April coming and teaching us about Reiki and self-care. And these groups are specific for BIPOC folks, so Black, Indigenous, people of color.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
gotcha.
so we're doing a lot of different things.
Yeah, and I understand that it is so important to meet people where they are culturally.
Correct.
Because we're not all the same.
Right.
When we were talking about the different things and people being vulnerable to sex trafficking, as you work with some of these folks, what are you hearing? What are some of their stories?
I think there are a lot of conversations, and I can understand why people are very protective of this information. I think it's hard to get to the point where people can trust you with issues like sex trafficking or being victims or survivors. So what I've seen people for a year that just now are opening up about some of these struggles. And sometimes, or oftentimes, it comes out more of maybe in a protective way of like, well, I decided to do this versus I was, forced into this, right? And I think that makes sense, right? To try to gain back some of that power that sometimes traffickers take,
right,
just by virtue of who they are. So we don't just work with sex trafficking victims or survivors. We work with the LGBTQ community. And by default, we know that we are serving people who have been victimized in this way or who have survived.
Right. And you may be working with many more than you know, because takes a while to disclose, or there's that trust factor. They have to be comfortable enough to say this.
Yes, and I think that it's a very traumatic event,
Absolutely.
and it will take a lot of time to build that trust, right? I don't expect people to walk in and
Right, here it is.
tell me
Yeah.
all of the things that are happening
Yeah.
or all their secrets, because
Yeah.
I also understand that they don't necessarily know me, and they don't know. I can tell them, you can trust me, but it doesn't work that way, right?
Yeah.
Trust is one of those things that we have to earn by being there, by asking questions, but allowing people to disclose that information as they feel comfortable, right? Because if we're trying to pry that kind of information, I feel like more folks will just
Yeah, the
close
wall
down and
goes
they're
up,
like, no,
yeah.
I will never talk about this.
yeah.
So it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of patience and practice.
When it does come out,
Right.
do you have the resources, the wherewithal to help them?
No, not necessarily. I think that's part of the problem. We have high rates of homelessness, but we know that not every homeless shelter can be safe, right? So sometimes what our work looks like is training those folks who are doing the work of manning or working in shelters, right? So they know best practices.
Right.
So they know how to be inclusive. So they know how to be respectful.
Speaking of that,
Sure.
You have the people. We have several shelters. We need more, of course, but we have several. Are they reaching out to you saying, we don't know how to deal with this. We need your help, counseling in how to better serve some of these folks that are coming in?
Yes, we do have some shelters that reach out to us looking for trainings. We just made a partnership with Sojourner Family Services, and they've been very open, and they are kind of on the forefront of getting themselves trained and having those hard conversations of how do we serve better the LGBTQ community.
Right. Do we have shelters that would absolutely say, nope, you can't come? You may be homeless, you may be in big need, but no.
I don't know that they're necessarily as outspoken about it, but then what happens is that policies are not being followed the way they should, or workers are not being trained properly, so they end up alienating folks because they don't have the skills, right, to not misgender someone walking through the door, or not making someone maybe trying to house them in the wrong facility with the wrong gender, right? So if a trans woman walks in and they refuse to see them as who they are, as a woman, and they want to house them with men, then that's going to create a problem, right? You're going to put this vulnerable person in a position where they can get assaulted. So that type of situation happens.
Right.
And then as a trans woman, why would you go back to that place? Right?
Okay.
Why would you re-victimize yourself in seeking help, even though they may be the only ones who have an open space?
Right.
Well, it's not safe.
Okay, let me speak out of ignorance.
Sure.
Okay, and you can help me with this. Say you have a person who, I go either way. I ebb and flow. I need a shelter. Sometimes I stay in this one that's marked women. Sometimes I stay in this that's marked men. Is that a reality, or does that seldom happen?
I don't think that is. I think that is quote unquote a fear, but it doesn't really happen that often. There are people who identify as genderqueer or nonconforming, which means I don't want to be classified as male or female. I'm somewhere else in the spectrum. And so I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It may, but I don't think it happens that often. And I think what happens more often is that trans folks have to figure out which space is actually safe for them, right? So if the chances of me as a trans man getting assaulted in a men's restroom is high, then I may choose to go to the women's restroom, not because I identify as a woman, but because I won't get assaulted.
Gotcha.
Or the chances of that happening are less than if I go to the men's restroom. So I think the conversation really needs to be, how do we make the space safe for the people who need it, right? So it's not about trans folks having to pick and choose how they have to identify on a form so that they can be safe, but that the spaces themselves are safe for who they're supposed to be, right? So if a trans man walks into a shelter, that we know that this person may be vulnerable and that we have to be ready, right, to respond if they're not safe. And what does that look like for us as an institution?
So that is kind of what you're counseling some of the shelters on, right?
Right, correct.
Yeah. What do we need as a community? Obviously, we need more housing.
Yes,
We need more awareness.
right.
What are we missing, and how are we on that scale? How is the community doing?
I think it's a tricky question, right? Because I think that we as a society, hopefully, who are moving forward in expanding services and the folks that we see as needing help. But I also think that there's some institutions that just don't allow for change to happen. So I think it just gets tricky. So the community has very specific needs. And I feel like oftentimes we're made to feel like, well, yeah, but you're not the majority, so we shouldn't have to worry about you. Versus, oh, yeah, you do exist. Let's make sure that you're included in this conversation. So it gets tricky. I don't think a lot of services necessarily understand that. Not in a way that it comes across to the community as being a safe space. So it can be hard finding safe spaces for folks. And I think that it kind of goes across every aspect of our lives. Like, it's hard to make sure that we're safe at home and schools and then the public. So everywhere we go, sometimes we can be made feel as like, maybe this is not the safest space for me to be out.
If someone who is, trans or bi or gay or whatever, and they have been a victim of sex trafficking, or they are now, what would your advice be for them?
So I think in our capacity, what we do is figure out what is their most immediate need, right? Is it housing? Is it finding a job? Is it just counseling, right? Because folks are not necessarily in need of the first two.
Yeah.
So we do provide some emergency services, like food and clothing, right? We can, depending on situations, we can help people find, a hotel room, but our resources are limited, right? So we can put up people for a night, maybe two, depending on the situation. But long term, that looks very different, and that looks more like finding resources for them that will do more of case management, and maybe we'll provide the counseling, and maybe we'll provide bus tickets. You know what I mean? Like, so I think it looks more like going back into the community and finding those resources to figure out what is it that they need.
Are you finding that the resources are there when you go out to get them or
I
be
think
that liaison between that client and the resource?
I think they're limited, but I also think that we're doing a lot of work, of footwork, of finding places that are willing to work with us. So it's a work in progress. It's nowhere near where we need it to be, but I think we're making good progress in finding people and places who are supportive and who maybe have different resources than we do. And maybe we trade, right? What is it that they need? If it's training, then that's what we'll provide. And a lot of our services are free, so trainings are free. We just need to figure out a time that works for both of us, and then we can make it happen.
Very good. So, and we were talking about one of the biggest problems that that leads to some of the tragic things that happen. The homelessness,
Right.
Running away, whether it's running away or being kicked out, and needing that housing. But when we talk about that, are we talking? I'm thinking numbers. Are we talking about hundreds? Do you know? Do we know how vast that the problem is?
No, I don't think there's any specific tracking that we do in respects to that. I don't necessarily think that a lot of places that collect information ask about sexuality or gender. So it would be really hard. I think the majority of the statistics is that 60% of homelessness or homeless folks. So whatever the number of homeless people
Right.
in the U.S. is, then 46 to
Well, that percentage is big.
Right.
It's
right.
very big. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So the work you do is really important in connecting to these folks.
I think the center does a lot of work in trying to reach people where they are and trying to find the resources that they need.
Okay. The important thing is for them to know that they're not alone.
Right.
That there are places and people who want to help and who are willing to help, right?
Right, absolutely.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
It's been nice to meet you because we haven't met before, so I'm glad you came in. We've been talking with Sandra Zapata.
Yes.
I love the way you say it. I can't say it as well as you, but I love the way you say it. She is counseling and advocacy coordinator with Milwaukee LGBTQ Community Center. Thank you again for enlightening us and giving us some really good information. Well, I hope you got a lot of good information on this, and I'm sure you did. And I really, really want to say thank you for joining us for this podcast. And I invite you to look at some of the previous podcasts because, like I said, we've covered, so many topics dealing with sex trafficking. A little bit about the 411 Live. We are a nonprofit organization. So if you would like to help us out, feel free to do that. Just go to our website, and you can find us, those previous podcasts that I mentioned, you can find us on iHeart Radio Podcasts. We're on YouTube, of course, Twitter, Facebook, all the common places. We're there. And we also want to invite you to always get in contact with us. Let us know. Give us your comments, your suggestions about future topics, because we may take you up on that. And until next time, this is the 411 Live. Real people, real talk. I'm Beverly Taylor.